John, thank you.
You're welcome.
It's been a long history with us for the campus living from the very beginning, really.
Yes.
From our inviting of new investors into the unlisted fund, unlisted trust. You were there as the inaugural chair. Maybe we can talk about the relationship and how it came about to start with, because you had a long history in universities, a long history in the business sector. So you seemed to be the ideal man for the job at the time.
Well, certainly universities are my main area of operation. No matter where I head, I always come back into the university sector. I'm a bit of a junkie in that sense, but I have also spent time out. Since leaving the Vice Chancellor's job at UNSW, I went into the Macquarie Bank Board exercise. I'd also been chairman of realestate.com in the pre-dot-com crash days, in the dot-com crash days, and in the survival days after the dot-com crash.
So you saw all of that.
That's right, I've been through all of that. I got that scar tissue. But when David Gonski approached me to meet with you and Luca, when David Gonski approached me to meet with Guido and Luca, it was certainly something I was very interested in, and I came along to the meeting, and one thing led to another, and there it was.
There it was. Yeah. And it was an exciting start. Here we were soliciting the interest of a number of institutional investors, all super funds. We had already acquired the American portfolio through Century Living, Century Housing rather, and out of Houston, and so we had a pretty substantial business already. But as I recall, we actually didn't have a chief executive as such. We went through then identifying, I think, two.
There were two managers from within Transfield, I guess, who were lent across and designated as joint managing directors, and we followed that path for a bit and then moved on from that to a more regular arrangement.
Yes, and it was quite I remember, John, it was quite a demanding exercise, because this was a fairly novel approach. Here we were wanting to we had a model which was totally integrated as such, from operations to ownership, whereas a number of our competitors were quite distinct in terms of either mostly operators and rather than necessarily owners. So we had a totally integrated model. We thought that was going to be the model to win the day, and I think it's proven its case. But there was a whole lot of issues around structuring compliance, and apart from the actual business of managing the business, there was a whole question of structuring a distrust appropriately for these investors, and so there was a lot of time, wasn't there, and resources that were required to structure this business properly in the first years.
Well, it was indeed a very time-intensive exercise. 2006 had more meetings in my diary to do with CLFM, I think, than any other entity. But I was quite familiar with the corporate model, being deep within Macquarie.
That's right.
And that's what some people refer to as the Macquarie model.
Yes.
I mean, there are different versions of the Macquarie model, but one version of the Macquarie model was the corporate structure that Campus Living Villages adopted. So that I understood, and I understood pretty well.
Which is the trustee, independent trustee, that was responsible for the management of the trust itself.
Of the trust, and then of the assets.
Yes, of the assets,
so that I was familiar with, but and having been 3 or 4 years earlier the first chairman of realestate.com, and going through that process of listing, getting onto the exchange, I had some sense of what work would be involved in getting the governance aspect up and operating.
Yes.
But I dreadfully underestimated, in fact, and it turned out to be quite an exercise in 2006. But we came through successfully, and it was launched, I think, to great acclaim.
Yes, and the institutional investors were happy with the various structures that we'd put in place, and the whole compliance regime, and there was at some stage there was thought that the compliance was starting to dictate to a lot of what we were doing, but we had to do it. It was very much required and needed for the purposes of all of our stakeholders, particularly institutional investors.
Well, I think that's right. 2006 coming into 2007 was the heavy period of addressing the compliance issues, and I know there was some feeling that maybe we were being too compliance alert and governance focused, but come 2008 GFC and all of the mess that came out of that, I think those that had a strong compliance and governance orientation moved onto higher moral ground, if you like.
That's right. I think you're right, because here we were, fortunately, an unlisted property trust, for want of a better descriptor, infrastructure property trust. Most of the listed property trusts, basically created through the GFC. We didn't need to revalue because there was no market pressure to do so, and as such, the investors were happy and patient to see how things took their course through that. We didn't have any issues with our banks in terms of re-gearing as such, but even though we ended up going through a rights issue down the track.
We did go through a rather tough and sometimes tense period of rolling forward the debt. We came to a period in the middle of the GFC where that needed to be done, but it was done.
It was done, that's right.
And done, I think, quite successfully, and there are many other operators who didn't get to home base the way that CLFM did.
Correct. Well, fortunately, we didn't have the sort of the market pressures, having had the experience on the other side of the coin, also with with the realestate.com in terms of, went through the listing, but, the listed companies were definitely under pressure there and were needing to sort of having to address their debt issues quickly. And leaving us, that's kind of at the sort of the governance financing exercise, but we had a business here which was an exciting business, and John, you helped us so much in those early days break into the Australian market in particular, because you knew so many of the players in the university sector.
My starting point is I really deeply believe in the product. Having spent 10 years as a Vice Chancellor in a period when funding was being reduced and significantly operations curtailed in other ways, my basic proposition about lifting a university to world standing is that there are all sorts of efficiencies that can be reaped if only we can do it properly. My notion was that $1 responsibly saved is $1 now available for strategic investment, and one of the big areas for dollar saving is the university's traditional reluctance to outsource. There's this notion within universities, quite widely and deeply seated, that universities can do everything and they are best to do it all themselves. It's a DIY mentality. And at UNSW there was one time where I tried to involve Lend-Lease in setting up student accommodation on a property that we had. The council did not see it that way, and it didn't go forward. So I was quite aware of the benefits that universities could derive, could harvest, if you like, from responsible and ethical outsourcing, and campus living came along as, I thought, an ideal exemplar of that. It's an entity with good provenance. Transfield Holdings certainly seen as having a profile of honour, and having the experience to be able to work in this space. It was just then a question of finding the universities which had opportunities that campus living could help them fill and address.
Well, as you say, but it had to kind of be sold to the universities because there was this reluctance with that question of outsourcing, and I think having got a couple of runs on the board with Sydney University and Macquarie University, the others started to see, well, hey, maybe there's some sense in this, and as you say quite rightly, I mean, it doesn't. On the face of it, it doesn't make a lot of sense for universities to necessarily put their capital into these projects when they're sort of not necessarily. Yes, absolutely. Well, we could talk about how important, you know, on-campus accommodation is for the university culture itself, or for the university sort of strategy themselves, but it doesn't necessarily need to be managed by the universities directly.
No,
owned and or managed.
But also, if the university is able to partner with an entity which itself can raise the capital, can build the facility, and then can manage it in a way that is as good as or better than what is currently being experienced on campus from the university's own people, then you know, that's 10 out of 10.
And given the model was a build, own, operate, transfer, it was the asset was always going to come back to the university in due course. I think it might just take that opportunity to say why Transfield, because often people wondering why Transfield got involved in this, or how is it, what was our expertise, and the expertise was when we explain it in terms of our infrastructure experience and track record in build, own, operate and transfer. So those models of long-term leases with concessions, with government, quasi-government lessors was normal for us. So, and of course, being property development, architecture, engineering related building, that was well within our DNA.
My preferred model is for a university, as the Vice-Chancellor, my preferred model was to create competitive tension in those areas where you could do that. You can't create competitive tension in exam marking, but you can create competitive tension between those halls of residence which the university owns and runs and the new ones that come in. And UNSW is a great example of that. You had Bassett, Baxter and Goldstein, God love them. Then along comes the village,
campus living,
then campus living villages, 1,032 beds I think it was.
That's right.
Fantastic development. Then the university looks at Bassett, Baxter and Goldstein, knocks them all down, builds a fantastic facility, partly because they saw what was being done down the hill in the campus living facility. And I think both entities benefit from that. Campus living has a business model that is valued, and the university is able to lift its own performance. All the while, though, it has to guard against the do-it-yourself syndrome within the university, from the finance people who want to raise their own bonds, from the housing office managers, and from others as well. I don't think campus living is ever going to, or should, aim to run 100% of the facilities on a campus. It may end up doing that in some cases, but the best model is the competitive tension model, to have a partnership with the university where each one pushes the other to improve the services that are being given to the students.
Well, that's always going to be the dynamic, isn't it? You know, in terms of outsourcing generally, at what point does the outsourced provider actually offer the best product, the best service in the exercise, and that has to be tested regularly in the marketplace. You know, we were very much aware of that, and being, you know, outsourced providers with Transfield services over the years, clients were not wanting to be beholden to any one particular offering, and that's understandable, totally understandable.
It's a good business principle, no matter whether you're a university or a private operator.
Good business principle. Having said that, of course, the model that we were proposing, and it wasn't necessarily unique, because, you know, it was happening internationally. We see in the States exactly the same. It was a long-term lease, 30 to 40 years. Once you sign that document, there's a 30-year commitment, 40-year commitment to that service provider, in this case, campus living villages. Now, you reflect back. You know, this was we all agreed. You enunciated it now, John. It was a great model, and you believed in it. We believed in it. But there's so much in business that is about operating, you know, and actually doing the stuff, you know, and we had our challenges. I mean, we had a number of chief executive failures in a sense. You know, we went through quite a few, and also CFOs, and nevertheless, all the search exercises that we did and vetted, we still management is never a sort of a lay down misère. There will always be challenges, and I find that illuminating in the sense, because no matter how good the business is, you still have challenges in doing the business.
You'll have good periods, and you'll have not so good periods, and my experience is that the not so good periods often have to do with the CEO who happens to be in place at the time. I can think back to realestate.com, for example, and that certainly applied there. And I obviously won't go into any further detail, but and one could say the same with campus living. It's not an unnatural aspect. It's not an uncommon aspect, I think, of startup entities. Once it's a larger entity, then the experience is there. What's important, one of the things that I found to be very important in both the experience at Campus Living and realestate.com, is not only having a parent or a partner that has the financial underpinning to let you get up and going, but for it also to have deep organisational pockets, so that in the case of Campus Living, the compliance requirements can be met. And I think that was one of the strong features of what Transfield offered. A very close eye. Sometimes people struggled a little under the intensity of the gaze, but it was quite right, and thank God it was there leading into the GFC. But now that Campus Living in that respect is a mature entity, it's not so much a challenge.
Correct.
But the deep organisational pockets of your parent become very important.
Yes, I think that's true, and without wanting to obviously be known ourselves as Transfield at the time, but I'm also conscious of how the organisation grows too. I mean, yes, it started off at a reasonable base. I mean, what we had, 25,000 beds, but then it quickly grew, and I think as we were growing too, a number of development opportunities presented themselves, and clearly through that exercise, actual developing sites or acquiring sites, it was quite a challenging dynamic to understand the property dynamics in each of these territories, because here we were in the US. In fact, so we made a number of mistakes in the US, and didn't quite understand that culture. It took us a few years to understand how to structure the management team appropriately for the US.
Well, universities are very strange places, and they're quite different from the areas where most corporate identities have their experience. I mean, I see this as people from the corporate world come onto governing bodies in the university time and time again. I see the high ideal of the notion of coming into a university governing body and then expecting it's going to operate in much the same way as their board downtown. And of course it doesn't. And the clients, if you like, or the students to whom we have a pastoral responsibility are very different from the clients that you might have if you're running a bus company or a transport company or something like that. And one of the important aspects of being in this space is for the provider, in this case Campus Living, to understand that the universities are a different creature, and there's no point in saying they shouldn't be. Why can't they behave more like what we see downtown? But they don't. And I'd in fact defend that and see the virtue in universities being the way universities are. But it may, and therefore means that it's sometimes more difficult to navigate from point A to point B when the university is your partner. But you learn along the way, and I think that's what Campus Living is certainly doing.
That's right.
We did make some mistakes in acquisition. Sometimes
overpaying, not understanding the dynamic. We're off campus at times, and so.
Or sometimes the world changes. You think you've got clear access between your facility and the centre of campus, and then suddenly the block of land between you and there changes ownership. new accommodation is built, and you're now the second
kid on the block.
Second kid on the block. All of this is part of the learning experience, and the relationship with the university is very important. And you can spend years building that, and then the individual that you built it with moves on to something else, and there's a new person comes in.
And they have a different philosophy about what should be achieved in terms of student accommodation. We found it from our perspective, being new to the whole sector, universities, student accommodation, etc. It was exciting, and I think we talked about how we got to it. We sort of thought, well, the demographics suggested that student accommodation was going to be a growing sector, and we could see that we could be a reasonable sized player in that, or an entity could be a reasonable sized player in that. Really muscle up there and be one or two. All of that, and we found it so dealing with young people too. It was fresh in Australia, particularly. The whole student accommodation market was pretty new, whereas even compared to New Zealand, where there's more of a culture of kids going away from home and living on campus. Australia didn't have a lot of that up until recently.
Well, I think Australia is probably still the OECD laggard, if you like, in that sense. In America, forever, students have crossed state borders to engage in higher education.
Yes.
In Britain, the local council has some play in awarding student scholarships and so on. New Zealand, as you say. Even in Europe, students are more inclined to move out and beyond the home base. Asia, that way as well. I think the deregulation proposals that are in the public domain being debated at the moment in Australia will ultimately lead to more interstate movement of bright and able students. You'll see the University of Melbourne citing its accommodation as one of the advantages in travelling from Sydney to Melbourne to enrol in what they say is the #1 university in Australia. And the universities in Sydney will be making exactly the same argument. And I think it's to the better that students in fact do cross state borders to engage in higher education.
Good. So it was an exciting. It had promise of being an exciting business. It proved to be an exciting and good business. Nevertheless, as I say, we had the challenges of the GFC. We had the challenges of not understanding how property developments could work in a number of territories, particularly in the US, which was kind of remote and foreign to us in many respects. Then we embarked on a big push into the UK, and that's proven to be successful.
Very successful.
And we were seen to be really a very fresh and we were with a new offering in the UK. I think we were seen as a kind of very fresh and new offering. We were talking about it was student life as being that as you defined the responsibility of the universities as pastoral care. We were trying to make that one of our the key offerings in discussions with universities and negotiations with universities.
I think the UK was very fertile ground. I once read that Boris Johnson, the Mayor of London, commenting on his days at Oxford, cited with some positive tone how bad the student accommodation was, because he said that grunge is what made me what I am today. And there's no doubt that the characteristic of traditional accommodation in the UK does fit that description. Campus living came along, saw the opportunity, and I think Bedfordshire is a really great example of that, where the accommodation was brand new, but also the building was of an iconic shape, so that the university had, for the first time, a photo opportunity that would identify itself. You learn a lot by looking at how say 30 years ago, 40 years ago, Sydney University would always be, the Great Hall at Sydney would always be featured whenever the newspapers wanted to run a story on universities. Even if they're running a story on the University of New South Wales, they'd still show the Great Hall at Sydney University. And that's one of the reasons I built Scientia, to give the university, University of New South Wales, a photo opportunity, as it were. And Bedfordshire did that in the UK, and it gave the university that advantage, but it also gave Campus Living the ability to say to other universities, well, that's the sort of thing we can do. And I think Campus Living in the UK indeed is surging along, in part because of that sort of demonstration.
Yeah. So, John, I think kind of wrapping up, I mean, in the sense that, you know, it's a great story, and the fact that that we, Transfield, you know, exited, well, we had this review date 7 years after the trust was initiated. At that point, there was a mutual understanding that the institutional investors would prefer to sort of insource the manager, bring it in-house, and that's fine. And so we exited as the manager and as the investor in the trust, and I think it was kind of really a very mutually agreeable situation for everyone. And you're now back as a consultant, doing the odd things now for the group. So it's great. We still have a lot of our Transfield personnel that ended up transferring across, but whether it be, you know, Richard Gablich and Rob de Quayle, Martin Earp in his time. So they're all very happy to carry on with that business. So. That's turned out to be happy for all players, really. I think so. It's a good news story.
It is, and it's in a space that has great prospects.
And continues to have them. John, thank you.
Okay.
Good.